Hello, class. Associate Pastor Tyler here, and today I'm going to lead us through a survey of the Old Testament. And the goal of today's lesson is to look at the Old Testament the way it was originally structured when it was written, and the structure that we have today, and how that all came about. But before we get going, I just want to start off by answering the question, what is the Old Testament? The Old Testament is God's revelation to us. He cares about us enough to tell us what he's like through centuries of storytelling so that we will decide to have relationship with him. That is his biggest desire, to dwell among us and have relationship with us. The Old Testament is God's attributes in action. It's one thing for God to say he's faithful. It's another thing entirely when he shows us what that looks like. He is sovereign, and through the unfolding of the Old Testament, God's authority is on full display. And we have to remember, guys, that God's authority has the right to speak to us, and it's right in what it speaks. To fully understand the Old Testament structure, it's important to note that it looked a whole lot different than it does today. Even the name was different. Before the term Old Testament came around, it was known by names such as the Law and the Prophets, the Hebrew Bible, or as the Tanakh, which was the formal name used during that time. The Tanakh is an acronym taken from the first letter of each of the three sections that made it. When the letters T, N, and K are put together, in Hebrew, it forms the word Tanakh. So the first section, we have Torah, which in Hebrew, translated to English, it means the law or instruction. The second segment is the Nevi'im, which in Hebrew, translated to English, is the prophets. And the third section is Ketuvim, and in Hebrew, translated to English, is the writings. And you notice that there's only 22 books listed here, and you know that there's 39 in our Old Testament that we have today. And also that the order is a little bit different, like you see Chronicles actually ends the Tanakh. Well, it's the same content as our Old Testament. It's just organized and counted differently. The organization of the Tanakh reflects how the scriptures were understood during the time of Jesus. In this next slide, I made an illustration to just kind of show you what books are actually split up into the 39 that we have today. So you can see we have Judges and Ruth, which would be split into two books. Samuel split into 1st and 2nd Samuel. Kings is split into 1st and 2nd Kings, as well as Chronicles is split into 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Ezra and Nehemiah was one book split into two. Jeremiah and Lamentations was one book split into two. And the 12 became 12 individual books, which ranged from Hosea to Malachi, and that's what we know today as the Minor Prophets. So here we have the 39 books of the Old Testament that we have today, and you see that it's not in the same order, nor are they grouped together, but they're more individual groups or individual books, and it looks a little bit more organized. It's important to understand that nothing is missing, nothing is added. It's the same exact content, just combined in order differently. And you wonder, how did we get the order of the 39 Old Testament books that we have today? And it's through the process of canonization. What canonization is the process, the organic process, that God used mankind to form what we now know as the 66 books of the Christian Bible that we have today. And it's a process that spans hundreds of years. The finalization of the 66 books that we have today wasn't even affirmed until the middle of the 4th century, around 433 AD, at the Council of Carthage. But through that process of canonization, something happened, and a large influence of the way that we have our books today comes from the Septuagint. Now, what the Septuagint is it's the Old Testament translated into the Greek. Because of the widespread Greek culture during the intertestamental period, Alexander the Great took over the land of Judea. And because of that, the Greek culture spread so immensely that the Hebrews of that day, the Jewish people of that day, actually stopped speaking Hebrew and they could only speak Greek. And so there needed to be a translation for the Old Testament for them to read. and it was recognized and separated for clarity, language, and teaching purposes as the scriptures moved from the Hebrew culture into the Greek and later the Christian world. So the Hebrew Bible, the 22 books of the Tanakh, was organized by function. The Tanakh was arranged like this: law, prophets, and writings. And it reflected how Israel experienced the scriptures. The Greek world reshaped that order. When the scriptures were translated into Greek, referencing the Septuagint, they were reorganized more by type of literature. So instead of law, prophets, and writings, you start seeing law, history, poetry, and wisdom, and the prophets. And this is much closer to the modern Old Testament order that we have today. Christians adopted and expanded that culture. Early Christians, especially Greek-speaking ones, used the Septuagint and taught the scriptures in ways that pointed to Christ. So the structure became law, history, wisdom, and prophets. This makes the Old Testament feel like a forward-moving story that leads into Jesus. Because people in the Old Testament didn't have the revelation that we have today, which is Jesus Christ. So finally, I want to talk about why we should study the Old Testament. The Old Testament is invaluable. It's the incredible opportunity to know the character of God and the story of his relationship with his people. If we abandon them, then we abandon our revelation of God and the New Testament's revelation of God. If we don't understand the Old Testament, we cannot fully comprehend the teachings of the New Testament. The Old Testament develops major themes, and the New Testament supplements them. For example, the Old Testament teaches us God is just, and the New Testament teaches us he is merciful. This is important to understand both because if you don't know he is just, how can you fully understand or appreciate him as merciful? It just doesn't make sense. God doesn't waste anything. He gave us these books for a reason. I pray everyone grows to love all of God's word and not just what they think is relevant or easy to understand.